Hell Let Loose in its current state is unfortunately in a very sticky situation. A lot of people really just aren't happy with the game, it seems like, especially after update 15.1 and just the issues that the game has had for a long time. But if there's one issue that I always seem to hear about more and more every time I post an update video, it's the fact that people want new factions or at least new fronts. On top of the metric shit ton of comments I've gotten over the last year or so of people begging for either new factions or new fronts, Squad 44 has announced that they are bringing the Pacific Front to their game to probably revitalize the game and try to bring new players to their game, while Hell Let Loose has not ever announced a Japan or Finland front, at least since the roadmap of 2023. And I kind of want to play devil's advocate here for a second of why maybe bringing new fronts to Hell Let Loose isn't the best idea right now, at least. Now, for where I stand, I do want them to bring other fronts to the game. I think they would be really fun to have, but I want it done right with a balance of historical accuracy and a way that both factions can at least reasonably win against the other. So with that out of the way, let's get into some of the reasons why bringing new factions or fronts into the game may not be the best idea right now in the current state of Hell Let Loose. And the first major thing I want to touch on is the current factions we have in the game need to be finished. Now, all the factions arguably have good weapons at this point, or at least weapons to counter the other or sub-factions in the case of the British. But the British and Russians do not have a lot of maps to their name. The Americans versus Germans, or at least those type of matchups, have plenty of maps, and with the additions of Mortan and the soon-to-be Elsenborn Ridge, people are just not happy with the fact that the British and the Russians are kind of getting left behind in the map department. And arguably, I don't blame these sentiments. There are plenty of battlefields across all of World War II that you could pull from for either the Eastern Front or the British involvement in World War II. For the British, you do have some options, such as Tobruk, which has been mentioned plenty. Ortona in Italy, give us a new country to fight in. 3 of the Normandy beaches, as Britain or Commonwealth forces were at 3 of the 5 beaches. Or the Battle for Caen. These are 4 major locations the British fought in that you could make maps out of. For the Russians, the list is huge of what you could pull from. The battles for the Baltic and or Operation Bagration has a lot to pull from. Vitebsk, Riga, and just anything involved in that area could be big. Budapest, a battle that I don't believe we've actually ever seen in a World War II shooter title. And of course, the battle for Berlin or Silo Heights. I would be personally happy with either of those two, but I know a lot of people want Berlin and I don't blame them. I just hope they bring it in soon and that it's done correctly. Now, going back to the faction weapons, we have to address another potential big issue in are the new factions we would want to bring in, such as a Finland or Japan, actually viable for the current state of Hell Let Loose as it is today? Now, the one example I do want to harp on here is the British, because when they came out, they were hot garbage. Their maps were not the best, I'm looking at you, El Alamein, and their weapons were complete shit. No semi-automatic rifles, terrible versions of the Lee Enfield, in particular the P14, and just overall not able to stand up to the Germans, especially on El Alamein, where it's a very open desert map where the Germans have Tigers, Panthers, SUG-44s, Gewehr 43s, and just completely outclass anything the British have in terms of any sort of firepower, whether it be a rifle or a tank. And even though most of the issues have been fixed thanks to the facelift that happened in December and January, fixing the British faction as a whole, no one probably wants to go through that again with a new faction, because then they're not going to want to play the faction that you put in the game. And when you look at the 2 factions that I would see a lot of in my comment section, the Finnish and the Japanese, their weapons, for the most part, just can't stand up to the opposition they'd be facing. For the Finnish army, they do have submachine guns, bolt-action rifles, AT guns, and AT rifles, but the Soviets have 2 trump cards here. The SVT-38 or SVT-40, which they did have during the Winter War, although they were kind of unreliable, and the KV-1 heavy tank. Those 2 trump cards are big for the Russian army just in general, because they were weapons that no other faction or country really had at the time. Combine this with the fact that the Finnish army really didn't have a lot of tanks, and the few tanks they did have before the war started, the Winter War that is, they had a bunch of obsolete and outdated British and French tanks. The only modern tanks they got of the conflict were captured T-26s and BT series tanks. tanks they were able to capture off the Soviets, not actually have in their stockpiles before the war. And yes, you could maybe make the argument of, oh, just give them captured weaponry, that'll balance it out. But then that just makes for lazy game design, and it makes the faction not really be it. It just seems like you're giving a faction the same weapons and just saying, alright, go have fun. Or you're just copying, pasting, putting a different paint scheme on it and calling it a different weapon or vehicle. It just will appear as either lazy game design or just, it seems like a lack of effort on the devs' part, and people will jump on that immediately, whether that be me or anyone else in the community. And a major thing that made the Finnish army so effective during the Winter War and arguably the Continuation War was Soviet incompetence. You might not see that as much in-game in a game like Hell Let Loose because it's not going to be the World War II version of the Soviet High Command running the show. It's going to be people with hindsight powers and those who potentially know the game in and out. Now, that doesn't mean every game is going to be perfect or a steamroll on either side, because there's still going to be people who just are either new to the game or don't know the game in and out. Name a scenario and obviously a faction might win. But if the Russians have semi-automatic weapons, heavy tanks, against a foe that has very few tanks, no semi-automatic weapons, it could create another faction that no one wants to play just because of how crap they are, because they keep losing to the Soviets who just have better equipment. Now, in terms of the Japanese, they're largely in the same boat as the Finnish army, but there are some instances that you could maybe put in Hell Let Loose in the current state of the game without altering too much, that you could actually potentially have a fun time and keep it balanced with a regard to historical accuracy. The Japanese was fairly on par with the American army at Guadalcanal. So at Guadalcanal, the American Marines, for the most part, had M1903s as their standard battle rifle, which is a bolt-action rifle used in World War I. The Japanese would have the same weaponry. They'd have Arasakas, they would have some submachine guns and some light machine guns, while the Americans would have bolt-action rifles, maybe a handful of M1 Garands, and just overall not a lot of overall fully automatic or semi-automatic firepower. Another front that you could put on for the Japanese that would actually be somewhat balanced would be the British Raj, and it'd be a battlefield that, as far as I can recall, is not in any major World War II title or is really shown in any World War II video game that is a shooter. If there's any wrong facts here, let me know down in the comments. I'd be curious to know what games would actually have this front that's a shooter game. And the big thing I'd say here that would make the British and the Japanese here very balanced would be the fact that neither side will be using a semi-automatic rifle. And I hate to put such emphasis on that, but that makes a lot of difference when you have to deal with semi-automatic rifles and the other faction just does not have any at all. It's with this logic that I don't think bringing Iwo Jima or Okinawa would be a good idea if a Pacific Front came to the game, just because the US Marines are just going to completely outclass the average Japanese soldier who has a bolt-action rifle, compared to any Marine soldier that has a M1 Garand, Thompson, or anything that's either semi or fully automatic. It's just not going to make for a fun time. With these little aspects in mind, that actually leads me on to my third major topic to discuss about this subject, and that is how much of the game will have to be altered to make the new factions or fronts work. This is where you could pose those arguments of, well, maybe Russia doesn't have access to heavy tanks for the Finnish to put them in to make it more fair, or you take away these items of the commander abilities, or you make the map smaller or bigger, or anything like that. Just throwing out a couple examples there. And that makes me ask the question, okay, will that be endearing to the fan base? Will fans or players of the game be wanting to play these new versions of the game when it's completely different than what they know now? And as much as I think a new game mode could work for the game, I look at skirmish mode and see how much of a kind of a flop that was, even though in theory it was a great idea. And yes, you could find skirmish games, but it is a big hit or miss whether or not you get a good full lobby, or at least a lobby that is big enough with the player count that you can actually have fun with it. I tried numerous times, and it was definitely more times of getting less players than more players. But everyone's experience is different in this regard, so I digress. It's just one of those questions to ask the fan base, would they actually be willing to play something as long as it's a good product, such as if both factions are balanced and it's actually fun gameplay without taking out too many of the aspects that make Hell Let Loose what it is from any other game, or at least what we already have in-game. In the end of this, however, this is my opinion and my simple take on if Team 17 were to add new fronts right here, right now in the game, in the current state that it's in. Leave your thoughts down below in the comments. I'm very curious to see what counterpoints or what you guys have to say. I'll try to respond as much as I can, provided they are respectful and at least adding to the conversation as best as I can, or at least if I think it's a decent statement, I'll at least try to give it a like. But just something different than my usual formula. We'll now go back to my irregularly scheduled guide videos and third-rate meme shorts. But have a good day, guys. I'll see you in the next one.